Good morning, First Baptist Live Online family. How you guys doing today? You doing good? All right, guys, let's stand up together and worship. I said that again? Good evening. My bad. Not good morning. My goodness.
I love you, Lord. Oh, your mercy never fails me. And all my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment I wake up until I lay my head, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. I love your voice. You have led me through the fire. In darkest night, you are close like no other. I've known you as a father. I've known you as a friend. And I have lived in the goodness of God. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I surrender now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I'm surrendered now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God.
I'm going to sing.
Oh, and all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. Oh, I will sing of the goodness of God.
down into darkness. Open my eyes, let me see beauty that made this heart adore you. Hope of a life spent with you. So here I am to worship. Here I am to bow down. Here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. King of all days, oh so highly exalted, glorious in heaven above. Humbly you came to the earth, you created, all for love's sake became poor. Here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. And I'll never know how much it cost to see my sin upon that cross. I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon that cross. I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon that cross. I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon that cross. Here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. Here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. Bless your name. Say that you're my God. Bless your name, Jesus. Bless your name. Okay, so before Pastor Ron comes up, I know we have like offering plates around here. So if you want to give or feel the need to give, we have offering plates somewhere around here. All right, perfect. So let's kill the lights and just play a tune for like 20 seconds.
Our online team as well that are with us. I was just chatting with, saying hi to everyone online. Just got back in Monday night from Orlando. It was 78 and perfect weather, no humidity, and flew back into 22-degree weather and dodging hailstones on the. So it's welcome back to the Mid-Atlantic, right, where it's supposed to be spring, but we haven't told the weatherman that. So glad to see everybody. I know some of you are watching from other states as well. Hopefully it's warm where you are. And this morning I left freezing rain, and so that was a lot of fun. And finally got out of West Virginia. It was perfect coming into Maryland and Delaware. If you have a Bible, I just want you to turn to one passage tonight, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 10. And we'll take about 10, 12 minutes before we watch our video on experiencing God. We're kind of coming to the end of experiencing God and got 2 or 3 more sessions together. We'll keep you posted on that. But we've been looking at this whole idea of seeking God in order to be able to know God. And once we know God, we can love God. And once we love God, we can trust God. And once we trust God, we can obey God. So I know as Baptists, being raised, maybe not all of you were raised Baptists, but being raised Baptist, I was always taught as a kid, just obey. Don't ask questions. In fact, that's the way it was in my home as well. You know, don't talk back, don't ask questions, just do what we tell you to do. Maybe you were raised very similar, maybe you were more permissive environment. And many of us bring that into our relationship with God, that all God wants is our obedience. And I want to give this to you. God wants your obedience. But first of all, God wants relationship with you, okay? That's number one. And so that's why we use this formula that we've been teaching you for the last 2 or 3 months. Seek God in order to know God. And once you know God, you'll fall in love with God. Once you love God, you'll trust, because you can't trust somebody you don't love. So once you love God, you'll trust Him. Once you trust Him, you will want to obey Him. So it's a lot more fun to be a Christian when you're in love with God. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, so it's a lot more fulfilling when you really know God, and that's why Paul says in Ephesians 5:10, ever living to please the Lord. 1 John 3:22, you don't have to turn there, but it says, whatever we ask of Him, because we keep His commandments, and we do what pleases Him. And then 2 Corinthians 5:9, so whether we are at home or away, thought I'd turn this off, we make it our aim to please the Lord. So all of this is written out of relationship. All religion flows out of relationship. It's not religion first, and then you have relationship. It's relationship, and then you have religion. Religion is just man's thoughts about God. So tonight what I want to do, and next week as well, and the third week as well, as we wrap up Experience of God, is I want to introduce you in these brief moments that I have to who God is from a scientific and empirical and spiritual standpoint, and then describe for you what He wants, okay? Experiencing God has been good because it's talking to us about how to hear God and be driven by God and how we live in alignment with God. But I want to talk to you for a moment about the relationship between science and God. You say, well, I don't think there is a relationship. Oh, there is. And for many people that are in the educational system today, so many people believe you cannot be a scientist or have a scientific viewpoint and also believe in God. And the reason for this is the whole idea of what we've sort of inherited from the Enlightenment. If you, just so you know, I read history. In the 16 to 1800s, we went through a period in history called the Enlightenment. And out of Enlightenment was born modern-day secularism. You've heard that word, right? Secularism, which basically means that there is no God, therefore we don't need to have a relationship with God, and the only thing that is truth is what we can empirically verify through the scientific method. And that has sort of been the predominant thought for many, many years up until really the last few decades when things began to change about that. So what I've discovered is it's not science or God, like secularism says. It really is both science and God. So let me give you some ways of understanding that, because unlike Richard Dawson, you probably have heard that name if you've ever been studied philosophy or saw some of the debates between Bible Christians and these philosophers. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, these are all guys that said you cannot be really truly scientific and be a Christian because, and here was their reason, all religion is both irrational and primitive, and as Dawkins said, it really is just a mental illness. So all of y'all are mentally ill, just so you know. You got that, now you know what's wrong with you, right? That was right. And Sam Harris, a philosopher again, agrees. He says, we have names for people that believe in religion. And he said they are called mad, delusional, or psychotic. Now, I know that you may just rise up and say, wait, but what is wrong with these guys? Well, it's because at the basis of their belief, they have chosen to take a worldview that says there is no God. And therefore, if there is no God, then you believe in a God that doesn't exist, you must be delusional. Now, I want to show you what science says, because science, we've been sort of sold a bill of goods. This may surprise some of you that were raised in the belief that the Catholic Church, back when Galileo and Copernicus and Bruno, some of those great astronomers, when they were discovering that the earth revolves around the sun and not vice versa, when they discovered that the stars are moving in the sky and the earth is not the center of all creation, and they began to discover things about other planets, and this was basically a scientific view that came in. And for many people, we were taught in the educational system that the Catholic Church hated these guys, that they tortured them and prosecuted them and persecuted them and threw them into prison and killed them for their scientific views. Now, what you may not know, it wasn't until the 19th century that view began to be propagated. What you may find interesting, and this is where most major theologians, or most major, rather, historians believe today, whether they're Christian or non-Christian, is that these guys were not persecuted for their scientific viewpoints, but at times they were persecuted by the church for their religious viewpoints. Like in Bruno's case, for his views on the Trinity. Now, I'm not advocating persecuting somebody, but when we've been told by historians in the past that the church prosecuted people and persecuted people that believed differently than the church, then we've really been sold a false bill of goods. On the other hand, Galileo, which the common story, if you've ever seen movies on his life, we're shown that he was tortured for his beliefs about astronomy, that he was thrown into prison, he was prosecuted, and none of that is true. In fact, every major historian today will tell you that that is an untrue account of Galileo's life. Now, the Catholic Church did have some issues with some of his beliefs, and at times he did get in the face of the Pope about some of those beliefs, but he remained a steadfast Catholic all of his life. And when he was finally arrested for some of his views, which were not scientific in nature, he wasn't thrown into prison and persecuted and tortured like the history books when I was being raised used to teach. But basically, the history tells us that he was put under house arrest for a period of time and eventually went to the Archbishop of Sienna's palace and lived there for many months, able to do what he wanted to do. And finally left there and went back home and was able to carry out his scientific studies without any prosecution or persecution from the church, and he died of natural causes. He was not killed by the church. He was not persecuted. Now, somebody say, what's that got to do with the Bible? It has to do with this. What we need to understand is every person has a worldview that they approach life with. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, I remember reading about some atheistic doctors, and they were in a room, and their patient sadly passed away. And they exclaimed, oh, they're on to a better place. Now, they didn't believe in heaven or hell. They didn't believe in God, but they believed that there was a better place. Well, what was the evidence for that better place? Well, they couldn't give any reason. They just assumed. So basically, they were speaking not about facts, but about philosophy. Are you tracking with me? In fact, a lot of philosophers today will tell you, even if they may not follow Jesus Christ, that atheism itself is what is irrational. Because everybody has a view that they approach life with. Who am I? Where am I? What's wrong with the world? What's the solution for what's wrong with the world? The four basic philosophical questions that all philosophy is built upon. But we all approach it with a worldview which is not scientifically provable. You see, you can't prove that there is a better place. You can't prove that there is a worse place. But if my worldview is, well, I just believe You know, like the country song says, well, God needed another angel. That's why he took grandma. Well, it makes for a great country song, but it's not biblically correct. But when we have a country song mentality and we approach our worldview with that idea, I've heard a lot of people say at funerals, you've heard me say this before, you know, that God needed another angel, that I guess God depopulated the angels and needed grandma, you know, and so, but that's a worldview, that's a philosophy, not a fact. And you say, well, why is that so important? Here's why I want to tell you why it's so important. What I'm teaching my grandkids right now, they're 6, 7, and 7, and what I'm teaching them is that science was born out of religion. Do you realize that the major universities in America today, Dartmouth, Yale, Harvard, were formed in the 12th century out of Christianity? That the great world centers of thinking today were born out of Christianity. And that Christianity, instead of coming against science, has elevated the whole idea of being skeptical and looking at things and trying to approach them with a worldview that, of course, we would say in the Christian world is biblical, but allows for scientific inquiry. In fact, we love the fact that many of the inventions in medicine and astronomy and chemistry came out of a scientific viewpoint that was built on biblical values. Do y'all realize that? It wasn't atheistic people that came up with some of the great thoughts and philosophies and inventions and principles and thermodynamics and physics. It was Christian scientists with a worldview that approached things from the Bible, knew that it was right and proper to investigate things and discover things, like the fact that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, but the earth revolves around the sun. Let me give you another one. For many years, it was taught in history books that the early church persecuted people because that the church in the Bible taught a flat earth, that there was no such thing as a round earth, that you know, we were dumb Christians that believed in this flat earth. But the early Greeks that predated Christians knew that the earth was round, because they knew that when a ship went over the horizon, it just sort of disappeared. It is, you know, you just didn't keep seeing it for miles. I mean, why? Because the earth is curved, it's round. So Christianity knew that the earth was round, not because they had scientifically proven it, but from what the Greeks told them, what they learned from the Greeks, in their assumption that the earth must be something more than flat. It had to be round. I mean, let me just close with this. Here's what Kenneth Richard Sample says when he talks about how science evolved out of religion rather than vice versa. He said, Christians gave us the idea that the physical universe is an objective reality. You say, why is that important? Well, animism believes that there is a God in every rock, every tree, every blade of grass, that God is in everything. Therefore, you can't study him because you can't deify things. Buddhism says that everything in our life is a delusion. You realize I'm looking at delusions right here. You are a delusion. Therefore, you can't study it scientifically. That's why Buddhists don't study things from a scientific viewpoint, because it's all based on a lie anyway. Isn't that interesting? But Christians came along and said, no, the universe is an objective reality. It's okay to study the world and the universe. We also come from Christianity that the laws of nature are evolved out of Christianity, that there is an order and a pattern and a regularity to the natural creation of things, that the laws of nature are uniform throughout the physical universe, that the physical universe is intelligible. You may meet some people and have debates about that the world is good and valuable and worthy of careful study. This is what Christianity says in its basic approach to science. That it's okay to study things. It's okay to it's okay to test things. It also says that human beings possess the ability to discover the universe's intelligibility. In other words, we can study things in order to determine their level and experience of intelligibility. That there's a free agency of the Creator makes the empirical method necessary. You say, man, that's a mouthful, but what does that mean? It means it's okay to use science to discover things. Let me give you one more. That the intellectual virtues essential to carrying out the scientific enterprise are part of God's moral law. Now, I want to wrap up, because what makes this so important is that, and when we're thinking about God and science, is this. We need to remember that the basis of empirical study, objectivity, of being skeptical enough to go look at something and approach from outside is based in the moral and spiritual and empirical laws of Christianity. We don't take our cues from other religions. We don't take our cues from atheism. We have a world view, just like every atheist has a worldview. You know what the atheistic worldview is? There's no God. And so when I meet an atheist and he tells me there is no God, I say, prove it. Because you've got to be able, if you're going to take that viewpoint, you've got to be able to prove your viewpoint, right? But you cannot prove there is or is not a God. Can I just be really honest with you? Because you can't measure God in a test tube. You can't put God in these hands and say there's God. Now sometimes we look at each other and say, you know, and say I'm God, and so you need to listen to me. We get kind of high and mighty in our eye, and that's called sin. But what I love about this, and I need to wrap up here. But what I love about this, we'll pick this up next week. I want to help you rest assured. Teach your kids and your grandkids two things. One, everybody has a worldview, a perspective. So we cannot discount one against the other. So nobody can say that the Christian viewpoint is wrong because it's our worldview. Okay? Just like an atheist or an agnostic has a worldview. An agnostic, different from an atheist, in case you don't know. Atheist says there is no God. An agnostic says, I think there is a God or a higher power up there, but he's unknowable. Christianity comes along and says, oh, he's knowable. Meet Jesus Christ. So, what do we need to teach our kids and grandkids? Two things. It's okay to be inquisitive. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to use science. I'm a geek by nature, man. I love science and astronomy and quantum physics, and it just gets my head like racing. I study the Bible, but also like to read that stuff. Drives my wife crazy. Why do you have a book on quantum physics? I don't know. I don't understand it. I don't even think I believe half of it, but it sure is intriguing. And so, because I have an inquisitive mind. Why do I have an inquisitive mind? Because God built me with an inquisitive mind. So God wants you to look, to test, to study, to measure, because that's how God made you. We are not at odds. Here's the last thing. We are not at odds with science. Science evolved out of Christianity. And when you have that viewpoint, it changes everything. Let's look at experiencing God tonight.
And I learned the incredible lesson. When a little church gets to work together, God shows up and God produces the most amazing results.
I had the wonderful privilege of growing up in a pastor's home, and as you might imagine, going every week to see my father preaching on Sundays and being a pastor, my favorite game to play as I grew up as a child was church. And my brother Tom, who was just a year younger than me, the two of us would conduct church services in our bedroom. We had a bunk bed, and we would climb up to the top bunk, and Tom would be the worship leader, and I would be the preacher. Tom agreed to let me always be the preacher. He said, you can be the preacher if you want. He said, when we go to heaven, they won't need preachers anymore. But he said they'll still need worshipers, and he was looking for a management position when he got to heaven. So he would be the worship leader, and we would invite our mother to come and be the congregation because we knew that she needed a lot of church. And so we would put one chair in our little floor space of our bedroom. We would have our mother seated, and then Tom would begin by making some preliminary announcements and saying, immediately after the service today, we'll be having a potluck ice cream fellowship. We hope that everyone will bring something. And then we would begin singing, and Tom would lead us in singing all the children's songs that we knew. And my mother would sing away with all of her heart, and enthusiastically. And then once we had exhausted our musical repertoire, he would say, now our pastor is going to come and deliver God's word to us today. And I would get up, and I had a children's Bible that I preached from, and I had some actual rudimentary sermon notes that I preached from. I only had developed one sermon, though, so I always preached the same one. But I preached it with zeal. I preached it with a sense of urgency and conviction, and it was entitled, The Sin of Spanking Your Children. And as I would warm to my theme, I would say, there may be some here today who have committed this horrible sin against God and against your own flesh and blood, and even now the Spirit of God is convicting you and pleading with you to turn back from your wicked and evil ways. And I would just feel compelled to extend an altar call at the end of that moving message. And when no one walked the aisle immediately, I would say, now folks, we're not in any hurry today. We're just going to continue to sing until everyone has had the opportunity to be made right with God. And eventually, to bring closure to that experience, my mother would walk the aisle and rededicate her life, promising God that she would be a better mother in the future. And we would then dismiss the service and go have ice cream. Unfortunately, it never took all that long for our mother to backslide and on our backsides, and we would have to have another service. I remember after a particularly unpleasant week of discipline, my brother coming to me and saying, Richard, these occasional church services just are not producing life change in Mom. I think she needs a whole revival meeting or something. But as children, going through the motions of preaching and making announcements and singing songs, we discovered early on that there's more to church than just that. And it's not just about what happens on Sunday, but the church is a living organism. It's something that God himself has designed and put together in a very unique way, unlike any other grouping of people you'll ever experience. God is the author of the church, and he has placed his Son, Jesus Christ, to be the head of the church, and Jesus himself said that he would take personal responsibility for building his church. This unit you've been studying about the church and how it functions, and I want to just underline for you two very simple truths that we have to continue to remember whenever we think about the church. And the first one is simply this, that God is the one who puts the church together. He is the one who builds the church. And there's a wonderful verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 18, where Scripture there says that God is the one who adds members to the body as it pleases him. And so as a pastor, I was always asking myself, what else has God placed in our church? How has he equipped us? I remember at one point a man rose up in one of our business meetings and just shared and said, I'm just burdened about the fact that we don't have a camping ministry. He said, I grew up as a young man, and some of the greatest moments in my Christian life occurred while I was at camp. And he said, none of the churches in our whole association have camps, and I'm just burdened about that. Now let me just share a caution to you. When you're at church, we don't respond necessarily to every whim and thought that anyone has. Just because someone says, I think we should do this, you don't necessarily run after everything someone says. But when I sensed that a person had sincerely heard from the Lord, and they weren't trying to push anything themselves, they weren't trying to lift themselves up, they just truly had a burden, I would let them share with the rest of the body. And I'd watch to see what the Spirit of God did. If someone shared, I think we should do this, and no one else seemed to feel that way, I would take that as a caution that was not something that the Spirit of God was affirming in our body. But when I had this man stand up and start talking about camping, all of a sudden I could just sense the Spirit of God just electrifying people all over that little group. One woman immediately said, I would be willing to take a week's vacation and be the camp nurse. Someone else said, I could be the camp cook. People said, if you just tell me the dates, I'll be a counselor. And you could just tell that was resonating with everybody there in the church. It became one of the most successful ministries that church had. Every year, people found Christ and were baptized. We had parents who would just go out to visit the camp one evening and end up coming for baptism as a result of what they experienced. It was a wonderful ministry, and it came not because of the pastor's plan. It came because I just kept asking people, what do you sense God is wanting to do? What has God put in your heart? And why is he giving you that burden? Maybe there's others here in the body that will come around this and minister. Well, I was getting so excited about this that every time I would visit someone, one of the first things I would ask was, what has God placed in your heart? And I remember going to visit one couple that had just begun visiting our church. And I sat down in their living room and I said, turned to the husband and I asked him, I said, now, what are you really passionate about right now? What is it that you just get all excited about? What is it that just is important in your life and that you're bringing with you as you come into our church family? And he looked at me and a big smile came on his face and he said, I'm really excited and passionate about barefoot water skiing. You know, I thought, okay, God, this one's up to you. I don't know how barefoot water skiing is going to build the kingdom of God. I said, is there anything else in your life that perhaps is not quite as exciting to you as barefoot water skiing, but still you think about a lot? He said, no, I'm just consumed with barefoot water skiing. I said, well, we want to welcome you to our fellowship. We'll just let God show us how he could take something as bizarre as that and use it for his kingdom. Well, you know, the interesting thing is that the barefoot water skier met and got to know the man that was leading the camp ministry and found out that the lake where the camp was held was a lake that he often went to with his high-powered speedboat and did water skiing. And so he asked if he could come out with some of his friends and give a demonstration to all the teenage campers one week and then give lessons to any of the teenagers who wanted to learn how to ski. It was the highlight of the entire week. We had a bunch of kids there who never went to church normally, and their parents, who were not Christians or churchgoers, were calling the church the next Monday trying to already book their kids for the following year's camp because their children could not stop talking about how wonderful that experience was. That barefoot water skier discovered he loved working with kids and ultimately became a Sunday school teacher because he said, I can't wait for a whole year for the next opportunity to work with kids. And for years afterward, he was a faithful teacher. God took someone with a passion for barefoot water skiing, added him to a body, and people began to find Christ and to be encouraged and built up as a result. I could just tell you many, many stories of those churches who began to understand that God was fashioning his body so that it could be his instrument in redeeming a lost world. I was in a church one time and a couple of the staff people came to me and they said, they were in a larger church, and they said, we began to be convicted that we would just ask people to come and just support our programs and to give their money to support all of our efforts and endeavors. And they said, we looked out over all those people in our church and we began to ask ourselves, do we even know what God has placed in our own church? There are all kinds of talents and backgrounds and skills that we don't even know about because we just say, well, here we need someone to pass out a bulletin on Sunday mornings. We need somebody to work in the nursery during the service. But we've never stopped to say, God, who have you given to us? Who is a part of our body? So they formed a survey. And they passed out a form to every member and said, what has God placed in your life that you would be willing to place on the altar for God and let him use it any way that he would choose to? Well, they had all kinds of wonderful things come back. One retired man, his dream in life was, when he retired, was to buy a Cadillac. So he had retired, he'd gotten his final retirement sort of severance package, and he bought his dream car. He loved to drive that car, but to be honest, he was feeling a little guilty. Now he's retired, he's just driving around in this nice car. So God convicted him, he needed to put that on the altar. And so he told the church, if there's ever a shut-in that needs to get a ride to a doctor's appointment, maybe there's a single mother, and she can't get to the school to pick her child up, or just let me know, and I'll shuttle them. Well, all of a sudden, the church had a limo service. And this man was just thrilled. He loved to drive his Cadillac, loved to just minister to folks. It appeased a lot of his guilt for having this nice car. But now the church, if someone would call in distress, I'm stuck in the doctor's office, my child's going to be out of school, and I won't be there to pick him up. They'd say, don't worry, we'll get the limo, we'll send it out. And the church had a wonderful service that way. The other people put their guest rooms and cottages at the lake, and various things that God had given them in their hands. They said, if our church can make use of this for the kingdom, we want the church to use that. Well, things were going very well for them until one day these staff people that were telling me this story said it got a little complicated because we got a form from a widow in our church. And this widow said, I have been praying earnestly about what I could put on the altar for God to use here in my church. And I knew it had to be something of great value to me, something very important to me. And I asked myself, what is it I treasure and value more than anything else in my life? And she finally decided it was her cat. And she said, so I want to put my cat on the altar for God. At first, the staff said, we didn't know what to do with that. What do you do with someone's cat? I mean, what is the church going to do with that? They said, we didn't know. We thought we would better take this seriously. At first, we weren't even sure if maybe she was just joking with us or not, but they said, oh, we can't risk that. So finally, they called a meeting. What else do you do when you don't know what to do? They called a meeting at the church, and they said, if any of you have pets, and you would like to place your pet in God's service here in our church, would you come to this meeting on Sunday night? They had over 40 people show up. There were people that had snakes and birds and fish and dogs and cats and horses. They didn't all bring their pets to the meeting, but they all represented various animals, and they were passionate about those animals. They loved those pets. And as they're all talking, you can just imagine, as everyone's looking around, saying, now, why would God put all these pet lovers together in a room in our church like this? Finally, someone said, you know, every morning when I go to work, I drive right past an orphanage. And when I come home every day, I see all these kids out in the yard, and it just struck me the other day, I bet you none of them have pets. You probably can't have pets there in the orphanage, and no child should grow up without at least having exposure to a pet. He said, I'd be willing just to call those people and see if they'd be willing to let some of us bring our pets over and let those kids play with them. Well, he called, and sure enough, they were delighted. And before long, the church was bringing over all kinds of pets. Those kids would play with them after school. Then they found a children's hospital that was willing for certain pets to come in, and for those kids who were struggling to play with some of those gentle animals. And they even found a hospice where people were placed who were near death, and they'd find these little lap animals, dogs and cats, that would just lie there and be petted and just give that warmth of another living thing there in their lap. And this church developed buttons and T-shirts, and they developed a whole pet ministry. And they said people began to know our church. You're that animal church, aren't you, that has all those animals? And the staff told me it is the greatest single outreach our church has today. And they said it was because a widow in our church offered her cat into God's service. And God used that for his kingdom. Have you ever asked yourself how God is equipping your church? What does he put in your church? He's doing it for a reason. He has a purpose for that. Secondly, just to mention for a moment, not only does God build up his church, but he also makes the body interconnected. In verse 26, Paul wrote, if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. Or if one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it. The sign that you are a healthy church body is how fast it takes for one person to hurt and another person to feel the pain. If people can hurt in isolation in a church, it means the healthy is not healthy. You know what that's like when you drop something on your toe? How long does it take for your brain to feel the pain? It's instantaneous, isn't it? Because every part of your body is connected. And when one part of the body hurts, the rest hurts. When one part rejoices, the rest rejoices. And Paul was saying, healthy bodies feel the pain one with the other. I'll never forget when I was a college student. I was going to university. I went to an evening service at our church, and I went and sat down and was just waiting for the service to begin. And I was kind of looking around to see who else was coming in, and I noticed over on the far side of the auditorium an elderly widow sitting there. And this woman had lost her husband the previous fall, and she was there in church faithfully as she always was. And all of a sudden, I just sensed the Spirit of God drawing me to think about her for a moment. And it was as if God just said, Mrs. Clark's husband has passed away. It's the springtime now. And I've been listening to lawnmowers going. I've been watching people working their yard. And it was as if God just simply asked me, who do you think is going to take care of Mrs. Clark's yard? Her husband had done all those kinds of things before. She didn't even know where the lawnmower was in her house. I thought to myself, as God was prompting me to consider this, I thought, well, I don't know who's going to take care of her yard. Probably the deacons will check on that. And I just continued to sit there waiting for the service to start. But I felt a compulsion that I should find out who should take care of her yard. I thought to myself, well, God, I can't find out now. The service is about to start, and I have to prepare to worship you. And I almost sense God saying, I can wait. Go find out who's going to take care of her yard. So finally I got up, made my way around to the other side of the auditorium, and I sat down next to Mrs. Clark for a moment. I said, Mrs. Clark, I was just wondering, tonight as I was thinking about you, I said, who's going to do your yard work for you? Who's going to take care of all those things, the tree limbs that have fallen down into the yard? And I'll never forget the look that she gave me. She was a wonderful British lady. And when she lost her husband, she was the kind of person who just absolutely did not want to be a burden to anyone. So she had not told the church, she had not put in any requests. She was not going to be a burden just because she was a widow. She was going to find some way to take care of things, but she didn't know how to do that. And so she had been praying earnestly every day, God, would you help me? I don't know what to do, but I don't want to be a burden to my church. They have so many other important things to do. And all of a sudden, here's this lanky college student saying, God just impressed me. I need to ask you, who's going to take care of your yard? She said, I don't know, but I've been praying for God to send someone. I said, I'll be there on Saturday. I went over there and had to dust off her lawnmower and clean it all out, and there have been branches falling all through the winter and spring all over her yard. It was a huge task, and I cleaned it up and put things away, and as I was mowing the yard just on the last little bit of her side of her house, I saw her come out, and she had a little handful of money. She was not going to be anyone's debtor. She was going to pay me for what I had done. And as I was sort of putting the lawnmower away, she came up with a little handful of money I knew was so precious to her. And I don't tell you the story to make me sound like a saint, because I wasn't one. I just clearly knew what God wanted me to do. I just said, Mrs. Clark, I'm just telling you, I cannot take your money. It would just be wrong for me. Now, I'm not averse to receiving money, but I can't take it from you. I just know it'd be wrong. I said, I've just enjoyed doing this for you, and I'll come every week during the summer and take care of your yard. But I said, I'm not a complete saint. I said, I do know that you like to bake. And I said, anytime you're baking any of those incredible cinnamon pastries or anything else, just if you want to bring a few by with me, I've got 3 roommates, we'd be happy to receive them. Well, that was on a Saturday. The next morning, I went to church. I walked into the foyer of the church, and I thought I'd walked into a bakery. Everybody was buzzing. They thought that there was a potluck supper no one had told them about. The place just was filled with wonderful smells of baking. She had baked all Saturday evening and had brought in just a tray load full of baking. And as soon as she spotted me coming in the door, she brought me over and pointed and said, oh, that's for you. There'll be more next week. She said, I was voted roommate of the century by all my roommates. And for the rest of that summer, this university student and that widow developed a wonderful relationship. How does a widow and a 20-year-old college student get linked together that way? Well, God puts them in the same body. And when a widow's hurting, the college students feel the pain. That's what a healthy body does. If we're not feeling that way, or if a church has found that it has lost a lot of members and people have left upset, or the church is divided, do you understand what that does to a body that God has designed? Every inactive member in your church is someone God knew that church needed to effectively do all that God had designed it to do. Every person now that no longer attends or serves is someone God knew that church needed to accomplish all that God intended for it. We're all to be a part of a body. And if we're not a part of a body that is healthy, that is serving together and using each person as God has placed them in the body to extend His work and His kingdom, then we need to review once again and say, God, why did you add me to this body? What is it you've placed me here for? And Lord, am I connected with others in such a way that if there's ever someone here who needs to be encouraged or is hurting, Lord, would you help me to feel that pain so that I can be a part of your answer in their life?
In 1993, we were still a small church.
Sprinted all the way up here. All right, guys, we are so happy that you guys watched Experiencing God with us. Now we're going to be transitioning into our small groups. So obviously, if you're here live, we have small group tables to the side. Small group leaders, go and do your thing. And if you're on Zoom, we also have a Zoom small group that you guys can join. Have a great night. walk with the King.